Hello, everyone. This is a thematic course overview, introduction to the subject matter of the course, which is moral philosophy. And I'll be giving you my ideas about what the subject is and what issues and questions specifically we will be covering for the course. But I think that the first thing to do is get some idea of what the subject matter is. What is moral philosophy? The course is called something like Moral Foundations or something like, I'm not really sure. It's an introduction to moral philosophy. So we need to have some notion of what the subject matter is that we're studying. What is moral philosophy? There's two terms there, basically: uh, morality and philosophy. So, putting those two things together should help quite a bit. Let's start with philosophy, if you don't mind. Um, we could talk about morality in a non philosophical way. We could do a review of customs and beliefs through the centuries in different cultures at different times and talk about what people thought was good or thought was right or thought was the right way to live or thought was the right way to approach moral questions. This is not that. This is not a survey of moral opinions. This is a philosophy course. And philosophy, whether it's moral philosophy or any other sort of philosophy, philosophy deals with the most fundamental questions. And if it was a different sort of course, not in moral philosophy, but it would ask questions like, what is real? How do I know what I know, or at least what I think I know? I mean, that questions go on and on and on. And those are the most basic questions of what we would maybe call metaphysics and epistemology. But you can see that they're basic questions. And so if we focus philosophy's attention on morality, we ask, you uh, what is morality? And let's say, conceptually at its most basic, um, you could think of it as a series of related questions. Um, the Greeks asked the question first in Western history: what is the good life? Which is essentially, how am I supposed to live? I'm a human being. I have the capacity to reason and think. I'm not merely an animal that lives on instinct and habit. I am a human being, meaning I'm a rational creature, so that I not only live, I reflect upon my life. So I can ask the question: how am I supposed to live? Is there a way to live that's better than another? How am I supposed to organize my life? What sort of person? You know, what sort of person am I supposed to be? These are the pretty basic questions. And moral philosophy, at least, especially when it comes to Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle's virtue ethics, which is something we'll be talking about. Those are the sort of questions that we're going to ask. Another way of approaching it, in terms of fundamental questions, philosophical questions focused on morality, is um, what is the good? You might say. Um, there are different answers to that. Question: Is there anything good in itself? That is there anything intrinsically good in the world? Or are all good things relative to some desire? You know, which is there anything intrinsically good? This leads to other questions. The questions multiply. If there's anything intrinsically good, does that mean that the good is the same for all? That is it a universal? Is the good for a human being something that is trans-historical and transcultural? This brings up the questions of relativism and objectivism. Is there one morality for all human beings, or must moralities be relative to cultural values which are changeable? Who knows? Um, another How do I determine the right thing to do? If I'm interested in doing the right thing, whatever that means, what approach should I take? For instance, to give you an example of what I mean, and something that will come up in the course, we talk about doing the right thing. Is it determined by the results of my actions? That is, the consequences? Or is it determined by something else? What we'll see is that some philosophers think that yes, doing the right thing is a matter of what circumstance, or excuse me, what results flow from your action. Other philosophers think differently, that doing the right thing is about following certain rules, no matter what the consequences are. So, this gives you some notion, uh, these questions. What is morality? What's the good life? How am I supposed to live? What sort of person am I supposed to be? What is the good? How do I determine whether something is good? Are there some things which have value and are good in themselves? Or are all things that we call good relative to certain desires and presuppositions? Is there anything that's intrinsically good? And if there is, does that mean that what's good is the good for all? That is good for all people, despite change differences in culture. If I'm talking about my actions and trying to order my actions, how do I determine the right thing to do? Is it determined by the results of my actions? Let's say the amount of happiness that I create through my actions, or is there something else that determines it? So, this is just an example of the kind of questions, philosophical questions, that any introduction to moral philosophy will ask. How about us? What are we doing specifically in this course? This course pursues a number of basic issues through classic and contemporary readings in Western moral philosophy, I should say. Western oriented, meaning having its origins in European culture, American culture. We will not be looking into the moral philosophies of other civilizations, for instance, India, China, Africa. Um, we'll be looking, at Western moral philosophy. And these are the kind of typical questions and typical subjects that come up in any introduction. So the class, if you look at the readings, the class is pretty much divided up into 6 subjects. The first is what I'm calling a metaethical subject, and that's objectivism versus relativism. Metaethics is when, instead of, say, doing moral theory and saying this is the good, that's moral theory. Metaethics is when you look at the phenomenon of morality as a whole and you ask questions about it without committing yourself to any particular moral theory or any particular conception of what morality is. Um, that is, what the right thing to do is and why. Instead, you're looking at morality or ethics. It means the same thing, by the way. Ethics and morality, completely synonymous. Uh, so the question of objectivism and relativism is essentially the question about whether morality can be objective, meaning whether it's factual or universal or a part of the world that we can discover, or whether morality is relative, that is, relative to certain presuppositions, desires, cultural habits, things like that, or even individual ones. So the first subject that we'll be looking into, excuse me, is the question of objectivism versus relativism. If you're a moral objectivist, you believe that there's a truth of the matter in morality. That is, the right thing to do is there's a correct answer to that, and it's one size fits all for all human beings. If you're a relativist, then you think that there are many moralities, each of which is equally valid. We'll be looking into that question. Then we'll move into actual moral theory. Now, moral theory is different from metaethics insofar as a moral theory says, well, this is the good, and this is the basis for a moral life, and that's why. It's more committed to one way of looking at morality and saying this is the way that just morality is. The first moral theory we'll look at is utilitarianism, which is basically saying that what makes an action good or bad is its effects on human happiness, its utility for human beings. And so if we say that what Jim did to Joe was bad, the basis for that is that in some way or another, Jim's actions had bad effects for Joe, made him unhappy or made him suffer. If we say that what Jim did to Joe was good, what we mean is that Jim, in some way or another, made Joe happy. So utilitarianism says that it's the consequences that matter and determine the moral value of an act. When we move on to Kantianism, the next moral theory, Kant, moral philosophers, we'll see, said no, it's not the consequences that matter. It's essentially doing your duty. There are certain rules or imperatives that you need to follow in order to uphold the moral law. And the moral law is what dictates what's right to do. And as we'll see, that boils down to a couple of imperatives about how you should act. And it really has nothing to do with consequences like utilitarianism. We will then move on to Aristotelian virtue ethics as a moral theory, which is a completely different way of looking at morality, which says that it's not so much that we should be focused on acts and whether they're good or not. We should be focused on the kind of people we are and whether that person is good or not. And that's a matter of the virtues. For Aristotle, ethics was a matter of training yourself to act in the right way at the right time. And that's what he called the moral virtues such as justice, temperance, courage, wisdom, moderation. I think I said that already. Sorry. So it's a different way of looking at it and saying that the way to think of ethics is to think of how you develop as a human being, not so much focusing so much on actions as on the development of a person. So those are the three basic moral theories that we'll be looking at: utilitarianism, Kantianism, and Aristotelian virtue ethics. In part 5 of the course, you move on to the relationship between morality and religion, which is essentially asking whether morality must have a religious basis or whether it is independent of religion. And then we will finish up the course with some selected issues in applied ethics, meaning specific ethical issues. For instance, world hunger. What are our duties or lack thereof in terms of giving charitably to make sure that other people have enough to eat around the world, or issues. So the applied ethics is not moral theory; it's looking at specific issues and trying to figure out the morality of them, and that's how we'll end the course. So I hope that this helped to give you some notion of what we're doing in this course, what the fundamental subject matter is, and how we will be approaching it.